I myself got called a jihadist by a Newsweek op-ed editor this week because I said we needed to wait for more information to come out. Hey guys, welcome back to the Base Politics Podcast. I'm Hannah Cox with Brad Polumbo. This week, free speech is in danger amid war in Israel. TikTok worries about a draft, and Gen Z supports Hamas. Let's jump in. Well, all right. So, guys, we want to address a few things. Obviously, the past two episodes, we've had to lean heavily into the Israel-Palestine conflict. That has completely sucked all of the air out of the room, and there is no signs that that will turn around anytime soon. I think the thing that has been most concerning for Brad and I over the past week is that we're noticing a trend that is a pretty familiar one following a crisis, particularly a crisis that involves war. And that is that while we're waiting for all the pieces to sort themselves out, while we're waiting to see what the actual military response is going to entail, there are no shortage of people, particularly in politics and politicians in particular, who are rushing to use this crisis as an excuse to tread on civil liberties. We saw this after 9/11. Those consequences were quite dire. We continue to live with many of the ramifications of the decisions that were made in the month or two after 9/11 to this day. And I think that, in my opinion, I thought that we would at least have learned some lessons over the past couple of decades from that. But unfortunately, there are far too many people who don't seem to have taken note of that at all. And they're rushing to especially go after free speech, but a number of other civil liberties as well. And then on top of that, I think there's just a very toxic culture right now where people are demanding that you pick a side, that you absolutely must be all the way in on one side or the other, that you cannot even pretend to see nuance in the situation, that even showing concern for lives on the other sides at times means that you are in the pocket of those people, that you support the terrorist or you support the Zionist or whatever the other is of the person that you're talking to. I myself got called a jihadist by a Newsweek op-ed editor this week because I said we needed to wait for more information to come out about a story that Israel was actually being framed for regarding a hospital and its bombing. So the temperature is at a top notch, and it's not doing anybody any favors. We do need to wait for more information to come out at all times, but especially when we're in the midst of the fog of war. We certainly shouldn't be trying to dehumanize anybody, much less people who are anti-war, who are trying to show concern for actual lives that are on the line, and that are trying to ensure that we don't do things that could put American lives in more danger. So I think people need to be very wary of those voices, pay attention to which commentators are rushing to politicize things, to make things partisan or tribal, which people are rushing to give their opinions before there is full information. And just be aware that there are many forces that absolutely want war at all times and that do want war in this conflict. And you need to be on guard against that and use some wisdom. Unfortunately, the people we're going to cover today, for the most part, have not been in that latter camp.
So the one thing I'd add to what you say is it's at times like this where it can be really tough to stick your neck out for free speech because, all right, it's the free speech of people who are celebrating Hamas's killing innocents. Like, that is some of the most despicable speech you can imagine. And nobody wants to be seen as condoning that or sympathetic to that. Or it's like, it's the worst of the worst in this case. So maybe we can just make an exception or whatever. But it's actually the opposite of. And also, if you do speak out, you'll get so quickly attacked as supporting terrorism or being anti-Semitic or soft on terrorists or all these things that no one wants to be labeled as. And the problem is that that's exactly when you have to speak out, because these kinds of things are frankly all or nothing. You can't have free speech mostly, or free speech just not for the really offensive and bad things. And so you have to defend it across the board. And in fact, the times where it's most difficult to defend free speech, like right now with the temperature so high, emotions so inflamed amid so much war and tragedy, are the times that defense is the most necessary and is needed the most. But it's also exactly when it's most difficult to do so, and doing so requires the most slings and arrows being weathered. And so we've seen a lot of fair weather free speech warriors suddenly fine with some of the things we'll discuss today, but that's not going to be us. And if there's one thing I'll hang my hat on, really, no matter what the cost is I will defend free speech, including the most vile and unpopular viewpoints. So that does bring us to our first topic, which is Ron DeSantis, who has come out and said that he thinks college students here on student visas who speak out in pro-Palestine or pro-Hamas demonstrations should be targeted for deportation. Take a listen to what he had to say.
And I think what this terrorist attack in Israel has shown us is we're vulnerable from all the people that have come illegally because they have come from Iran, too. It's not just Mexico, yes, Central America, Russia, China, Middle East, all that stuff. But I think what we also saw when the blood wasn't even dry on the Israelis who had been massacred, you had people in America going out protesting in favor of Hamas. Yes. And that's like very chilling. Some of these people are not U.S. citizens. They're student visas. So as president, if you're on a student visa and you're a foreigner and you're out there celebrating terrorism, I'm canceling your visa and I'm sending you home.
And on the other side of this equation, we have the Biden White House, who is taking the opposite view. Take a listen to this White House spokesperson who was asked about the same question.
And there's been an uptick on the right among some Republicans who have called for students or foreign nationals who are demonstrating in some of these pro-Palestine demonstrations or, allegedly pro-Hamas demonstrations to have their student visas pulled or to face deportation. What is the administration's response to those kinds of remarks, that kind of rhetoric?
I would just tell you, you don't have to agree with every sentiment that's expressed in a free country like this to stand by the First Amendment and the idea of peaceful protest. I'll leave it at that.
So, Hannah, I don't say it often, but I'm Team Biden on this one. And I'm not a partisan guy, so I'll tell you when I think people are right or wrong. And I think that the Biden administration is making the right call there.
Yeah, same here. I think DeSantis has shown himself to be a true enemy of free speech. There's been numerous other instances that we've covered on the show and that I've covered in my writing, from the social media censorship bill law that he signed that is now going to the Supreme Court because it is anti-constitutional, to his actions against Disney over their speech. And now this. And I think he's somebody who just wants the headlines. I don't think he really is a super principled guy, or this is something he's given a lot of thought to. Immigrants bad, let's punish them for things we don't like. That seems to be a pretty safe space for people of his ilk to be in on the right these days. But you and I both picked up on these comments quite quickly and rightfully called them out as being not only anti-constitutional, anti-free speech, but just severely problematic in his thinking. I think that if you want to understand how to evaluate rights, because I had so many people when I spoke out against this and said, this is not free speech, this is not okay, say that non-citizens don't have rights. Now, before we get into the actual wonkiness of whether or not the people he's talking about do have certain rights in the situation, I want to say that the way I evaluate these things is that if you believe the Constitution does not grant rights, which it does not, that is Constitution 101, and if you believe that the rights that it guards are God-given natural rights, which I do, we don't just have the ability to make up rights. That's why things like healthcare aren't rights. That's why things like free school isn't a right. You have certain enumerated rights that are God-given natural rights that you possess, whether or not government grants them to you. Government can only take them away from you. And free speech is one of those. So whether or not you were born in America, I think that you have a God-given right to free speech, period. I don't think that our government should ever be used as a weapon against people to punish them for their speech, period. Now, on top of that, I don't think that he has the rights in these particular situations to go after this group of people because most of them do have a legal status if they are here on a visa, which I believe would actually give them even further protection under our Constitution. But even if that weren't to exist, I just think a basic constitutional 101 understanding of free speech would say that this is not something you should be doing. And it's very, very clear to see that if you were to give somebody like DeSantis the ability to do this, to just kick people out over speech he dislikes, then there is no end in sight to that, right? And that is why I just cannot fathom being so short-sighted as these people, as their supporters, when they say these kinds of things, because clearly if you do that, that's going to give the next Democrat the opportunity to kick people out because they celebrate the Second Amendment and say that that's hate speech and that that's violence. They want to kick people out who believe in that. This is a bad precedent. It's a bad idea. And again, if you do stand for free speech, you have to stand for free speech that you hate and that you detest and that is disgusting, or you don't stand for it at all.
Yeah, no, I agree. But there's two separate questions there that you just hinted at. One is the question of legally and constitutionally, is this something a president could do? The second question is it something a president should do? And for me, the second question is easier than the first. The first is actually very messy, very complicated. The second isn't, because unless either a president can target and retaliate against people because he dislikes their viewpoints, or they can't. So unless you would be fine with a president AOC in the future targeting Israeli foreign exchange students or students from around the world who defend the actions of the Israeli government, which in her view, she might say is supporting genocide, supporting apartheid, or yes, supporting terrorism, unless you would be okay with that, you can't be okay with this. It's kind of an all or nothing principle. You're either okay with government retaliation for speech or you're not. Now, it would be different if we were talking about like, all right, these students have committed crimes or they have actively recruited for Hamas or they are in some way materially involved in a terrorist organization, is a different question than speech. Them saying things like from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, which some people interpret as a call to genocide, right? That is still speech. It's still First Amendment protected speech because it does not meet the very narrow calls, the very narrow exceptions for imminent incitement of lawless action, right, or true threats. It doesn't meet those exceptions. It's First Amendment protected. And it's just a bad idea to go down this path of government action to punish bad speech. What we need is more speech. And what we need to is know who the bad people are. I'll be honest, if I was running a company, I wouldn't hire any of those students engaged in these vile protests. But I don't want them removed from the country. I ultimately want them to grow up and see the light. And the way to do that is through more speech, not through targeting and punishing them, because that will come back to bite you. Now, I do want to get into the complicated question of whether it would be illegal or unconstitutional for a president to actually do this, to actually selectively revoke visas for students who are here lawfully because you don't like what they have to say. This is a complicated question. So I reached out to the folks at the Nonpartisan Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, FIRE, which is basically the new ACLU. They are not left or right. They are very hardcore, principled constitutional analysts in favor of free speech. And I asked them, and they pointed me to several relevant Supreme Court cases, to case law, and we can all agree that protests that are glorifying violence against innocent Israelis, calling the Hamas terrorists who attacked innocent civilians freedom fighters, these things are vile and they are bad. But they are First Amendment protected speech. And according to Joe Cohen, who's a legislative and policy director at FIRE, the Supreme Court has said since 1945 that at least with respect to people who are within the borders of the United States lawfully, we all enjoy First Amendment protections. And that's true whether we're a citizen or on a more temporary visa. Now, he pointed me to a couple of key Supreme Court cases, one of which is a 1945 case called Bridges v. Wixon, which concerned this case where they were trying to deport an Australian who had lawfully immigrated to the U.S. over his alleged support for the Communist Party. Now, in that case, while ruling in favor of the Australian, the Supreme Court declared, quote, freedom of speech and of the press is accorded aliens, which they mean immigrants, residing in this country. In another 1953 case, the Supreme Court reaffirmed this holding that, quote, once an alien lawfully enters and resides in this country, he becomes invested with the rights guaranteed by the Constitution to all people within our borders. So they have established very clearly that legal immigrants have First Amendment rights. And so then there's a category of First Amendment law that protects you from retaliation for First Amendment protected speech. So Cohen explained that the question is, 1, do immigrants have First Amendment rights? The answer is yes. 2, is the speech in question protected speech? And yes, in almost all the cases we're talking about. There might be some rare exceptions where it's direct incitement of violence, or they're, like I said, if they're recruiting for Hamas, that would not be protected. But in almost all the cases we've seen, they're just saying vile things or endorsing acts of violence that have occurred in the past. That is disgusting, but it's free speech. So if they have First Amendment rights, and if the speech is protected by the First Amendment, then it is unconstitutional for the government to retaliate against them for that speech. It gets more complicated. There's a few counter arguments we can go into, but that's the 1-in-1 of it, Hannah. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that tracks entirely. And I think when you get into that second precedent that you mentioned, using the government retaliatory in a retaliatory capacity, that is what DeSantis did against Disney as well. We saw them speak out. He tried to use the government in a way to target them after that. So this is a trend to me that I think it's really concerning. I know I've said this many times. I get mad at the left for things, but I know who they are. They don't make any bones about it. They are openly anti-free speech at this point. My problem is more right now with the right, because I come from the right, and because the right purports to be better and purports to support free speech. And yet he is mostly getting cheered on by people on the right for these sentiments. And we just see, once again, how quickly people are willing to give up very essential liberties the minute they are afraid or the minute they dislike something or presented with something that they really dislike, even if they just hear it, right? These people are saying things that are vile and disgusting. Yes, but you're willing to throw away the Constitution because you've heard something that is disgusting. That makes no sense to me. It's so weak in the knees. And I don't think it's too much to ask that the people who run for president in this country, the people who are supposed to be our leaders, love the Constitution. That's all I want, is that basically people consistently love and support the Constitution. And yet that feels like such a tremendous stretch to even hope for these days. And it really does not speak highly to where we're headed as a country. And again, I think this is something that probably is more concerning to you and I, because we've been following this larger trend against free speech for the better part of 2-3 years now. And it just keeps building and getting worse and getting worse. And I feel that I very much think at this point, if things keep going in this conflict, we could see a whole lot more civil liberties coming under attack. And there's just not going to be the people who rise up and say never again, like I thought that there would be after the war on terror and 9/11.
And COVID.
And COVID.
Yeah.
We just got through COVID. Yeah.
But so the counter arguments that the DeSantis camp are making, including some of his staffers, like his press secretary, Jeremy Redfern, who have been conversating with you and I on Twitter over this. I mean, some might say trolling, but here I'll say conversating, discussing this issue with them. Like, for example, Jeremy Redfern, DeSantis' press secretary, says, quote, "They have a right to free speech. They don't have a right to be in the United States." Now, it is simultaneously true. They don't have a right to a visa, but that doesn't actually make his constitutional analysis there follow, because you also don't have a right to food stamps. But if you're on the food stamps program and then you criticize your government representative and then they revoke your food stamps, that is unconstitutional. Like, you don't have to have a right to something, in that you have a right for the First Amendment, from the First Amendment, to not have it taken away from you for protected speech, right? So that's what they're saying. No one has a right to a visa. Yes, we all acknowledge that no one has an inherent right to obtain a visa under our laws, but you do have a right to not have it taken away from you once you're here, because the government doesn't like the words coming out of your mouth.
Yeah, and I think that they are being disingenuous because, again, you have a right to free speech. That means you have a right to say what you want, free from government persecution or retaliation against you because of what you say. So any action you take when you are a part of the government against people because of what they say is a violation of free speech. Now, you as a private person, as you mentioned earlier, you don't have to hire them, you don't have to work with them, you don't have to sponsor them, etc. That is not a violation of free speech. And I think that they are just intentionally trying to muddy those waters and pretend like, oh, it's okay because this is not a violation of free speech. We're just like going after this other action. They did the same thing with Disney. You don't have a right to corporate welfare. No. But when you target one company and take away only their corporate welfare and continue giving it to everybody else because of something they said, that is a violation of free speech. And I think they're going to lose that case because of that. This is the same line of logic, and it absolutely doesn't wash. And I really would hope that people would understand those distinguishments, right? You in government cannot do these things. You as a private citizen can definitely have certain actions and reactions to things that people say, and you're not free from consequences of what you say because of that. But the government is where the line is, and that should be a very hard line in the sand.
Yeah. The other main counter-argument that comes up is people pointing to federal statute 8 USC 1182. And this statute, it says it's basically about giving out visas. And it sets out the conditions under which the government is able to deny people visas when they're applying. So in this stage where foreigners living in other countries are writing or applying to come to the United States on different visas, this law says you can use X, Y, and Z criteria to deny them visas. And one of those categories is support for terrorism. Now, it is debatable whether the speech we're talking about at these pro-Palestine / pro-Hamas, whether it all really counts as support for terrorism. But let's say it does. What's interesting is they think, oh, federal law gives them the permission to block people in the first place from coming here, so of course that means that they can revoke it for the same reasons. It actually doesn't follow that. But two things. One, is that federal statute constitutional in the first place? Some people would argue it isn't, but let's say that it is. It is materially different to deny someone a visa when they're applying from outside the country, because people outside our country, under current precedent, aren't recognized as having First Amendment rights. But once they come here legally, get a visa, and they're on U.S. soil, they are recognized as having First Amendment rights. So it is a fundamentally different equation, revoking a visa from somebody who's currently here, than it is denying someone to a foreigner who wishes to come here, because the First Amendment isn't in effect in the same way under our current precedents. So they're saying this is their get out of jail free card. They keep pointing out, yes, you can do this. This federal law says this is allowed. One, a federal law existing doesn't mean it's constitutional. But two, that discusses giving out visas or rejecting people for visas who don't have one, who are outside of our country. It's a very different story. And this is what Cohen explained to me from FIRE. Here, I'll read a couple quotes from him. He says, quote, "Once a person has a visa and is here, the Supreme Court has said that they cannot be removed in retaliation for their exercise of the constitutional right to free speech. The legal analysis might be different when someone is applying for a visa, but there is no question that the First Amendment protects all people lawfully within our borders from viewpoint-based discrimination." So that second argument doesn't really wash. And at the end of the day, it's just not a fight worth picking. Do you want to support free speech or do you not? Do you want the government to be weaponized against people who say outrageous or offensive things in the view of government officials? Because I'll say you right now, that's not going to work out well for conservatives, libertarians, center-right people, because you have a whole lot of progressive politicians in this country that think their /our milquetoast opinions are akin to domestic terrorism. So be careful what you wish for, DeSantis and DeSantis simps, because you might just get it.
Hey guys, Hannah here with some big exciting news. We are producing so much content at Base Politics that we decided to make a separate YouTube channel just for this show. So take a quick minute and go subscribe to the new Base Politics YouTube channel. We'll put the link in our show notes. We'd love to see you there. All right, so we have to turn our attention to another former governor on the right, Nikki Haley of South Carolina. She also has made some very anti-free speech comments recently in regards to these protests, and moreover, just seems to be more of the neocon persuasion. I want to roll this clip recently that she said at one of her rallies.
Our military ready for future wars, which are artificial intelligence, cyber, space, and make sure that they have the equipment they need to defend themselves when we're at land, air, or sea. We've got to be smart. We've got to be ready. I'm tired of talking about a Department of Defense. I want a Department of Offense.
Yeah, so I cringed. I don't know, maybe this was supposed to be a joke or whatever, but one, we're not supposed to be offensively just engaging in militarism abroad. I support a strong national defense. The keyword is defense, right? To protect us, not to go and invade the world. But two, as if our current military isn't a Department of Offense, basically. It basically is already. So I'm not sure what exactly you're calling for there, Nikki.
Yeah, my parents live in South Carolina. We moved there when I was 16, and I've lived in a lot of southern states. I actually joke that Florida's my only one left to check off. I've never been in such a pro-war culture as there is in South Carolina. That is a very big military state. They, of course, have the schools and bases in Charleston. But besides just that, they really do tend to be very hawkish in their views. And so I'm not totally surprised that Nikki Haley is of this way of thinking, since she is the former governor of South Carolina. But she's really been letting it fly for the past couple of weeks. I mean, she also said that Israel needs to wipe them out. And she didn't really clarify if she meant just Hamas or all of Palestine. She's been very
She also said all anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, which is controversial. I mean,
yeah, that's I strongly reject that notion. So yeah, she seems to be very interested in interventionism and wants more engagement in this particular conflict. And I just have multiple issues with her stance on all of that. But she took it even a step further this week, and she took to X to actually address some of the protests in particular that have been on the pro-Palestine side. And she said no more federal money for colleges and universities that allow anti-Semitism to flourish on campus. Now, I have to object to this on two fronts. One, while I think there has absolutely been some displays of anti-Semitism on college campuses, and it's disgusting and vile, and we have denounced it over and over, both on this show and on other social media channels, I have a really big problem with the conflation of absolutely everybody who's been at these rallies being an anti-Semite. I think there are many people who are very concerned with the plight of Palestinians, who don't wish any ill will towards people in Israel either. So I don't like that, right? I don't think that's helpful. I think, as you mentioned just a minute ago, there has been historically a push to say anybody who's criticizing the government of Israel is doing so because they are anti-Semites. And I don't think that's true. I think that there can be one and the other. Sometimes there is overlap, but
it's hard because there has been some overlap lately. Some of these protests have been very anti-Semitic.
There have, and that's also been true historically, right? There are some people who hate the government of Israel because they're anti-Semites. There are also people who rightfully criticize things that the Israeli government has done who have no hatred for Jews, me included. So
there are Jews who are very critical.
Yes, there are Jews who are anti-Zionist Jews. So it's an absurd thing to try to mesh those together. And I think that there is an agenda there so that they can shut down anybody who's trying to criticize the government of Israel with that kind of thing. So I don't like that her phrasing here is done in that way. Secondarily, even if it is true that there are anti-Semite protests happening on these campuses, it is still a free speech issue. Now, I would say a more base take would have been no more taxpayer dollars to colleges and universities, period. I'd be absolutely okay with that stance. I really don't like the government being involved in higher education, period. But that's not what she's saying. What she's wanting to do is target universities who allow free speech on their campuses. So to me, that's almost even worse. That's like the same kind of energy we saw where Biden and his camp have been wanting to punish social media sites that allow free speech on their websites. And so you're actually impeding two groups' free speech in that scenario, not only the people who are actually speaking, but the people whose property the protests are occurring on or the speech is occurring on. You're also going after their free speech and their property rights, I might add. So this is incredibly problematic from her. Really, really sad to see this continuing to pop up on the right.
Yeah, what's particularly nuts about her statement, because it's kind of like if Ron DeSantis had just, apropos of nothing, introduced a bill to eliminate all special districts in Florida, that would have been fine. He could have totally done that. Nothing illegal or unconstitutional about that. But it's kind of like this. It's like if Nikki Haley's position was just, I want to defund all colleges and universities, that's a perfectly legitimate position to take. Let's have the debate. That's not unconstitutional. It doesn't violate free speech, anything like that. But what she's saying here is I want to selectively defund colleges based on whether they allow anti-Semitism to flourish. Now, part of the problem is that is extremely vague. What does that mean exactly? Is she talking about hate crimes and discrimination? Because then maybe you could defund universities that aren't policing discriminatory acts or something. But if you just mean these anti-Semitic protests, which are what is in the news right now, which I agree, not all of the protest is anti-Semitic, but some of it sure as shit is. If you're saying that, then that's crazy, because public colleges and universities are literally required to allow anti-Semitic protests. They're bound by the First Amendment. So in public spaces, like I know you went to a private school, I went to a public college, and we had private spaces where anyone could come with a loudspeaker and protest. So you would get like a crazy preacher talking about how all gays are going to hell. You would get like the end times are coming. Like these people, and they are allowed. It is constitutionally mandated that in open public spaces that are on this government spaces, they're allowed to speak. So the same is true for anti-Semites. Like that's part of free speech. Being a bigot is part of free speech. And so for you to suggest defunding colleges for living up to their constitutional obligation is not just unfair to those colleges, it's anti-constitutional. You're trying to punish people who follow the First Amendment. And regardless, it's this same principle of government retaliation for speech. So it's fine to support defunding all colleges. It's not fine to support selectively defunding ones because you're unhappy with the words that are being spoken on those campuses. That is authoritarian and anti-free speech.
I think this instinct is also just one of losers. It's when people don't feel like they can address the things being said and win the argument. And I don't understand why in these situations. I think that anti-Semitism is awful. And I've never understood it. I don't really understand many forms of racism, but this one in particular, because again, I've been participating in a lot of the Jewish community's activities for some time. And the one thing I'm always struck by is just like the overwhelming grace and kindness that is so enveloping every time I'm at a service or a Shabbat, and just the resiliency of these people. I started a Judaism 101 class last week, actually. I'd been registered for it for many, many months. I've been looking forward to this. I had to wait till after the High Holy Days to start because I've been wanting to learn more. And I went to my first class last Tuesday evening, like really not sure what to expect in the midst of all of this going on around us. And growing up in the evangelical church, it's often been pretty pro-war, at least the denominations I've been around. So I wasn't really sure what would be said and how I'd feel about it. And I was struck by just how nothing was said political at all. It was all just like all about peace and loving the community around you and how to better care for others around you. And so I again, it's kind of off topic, but it does just blow my mind that there can be hate for the Jewish people, because I think that they are such an incredible group and I've loved my time around them and their faith.
Yeah.
But I think that the way to dissolve that, and even in my reading for my class over the past week, it talks about this from the Jewish faith's perspective. The way to overcome these things is exposure, right? To be more in the community, to allow more people to have that experience around Jewish people, to see how lovely and wonderful that they are. That's how you actually break down racism. I think that's the actual cure. That's the antidote for it. And so this instinct to just shut these people up versus to expose them to what I'm saying right now, right? Like counter experiences, counter information to what they have. To me, it just seems very weak. Like you don't really have the tools you need to go up against this enemy, and maybe you should sit this one out because there are plenty of people who do.
Yeah, I agree with you. Honestly, like a lot of anti-Semitism is just very stupid. So like I want to show the audience this tweet I saw, because I have been seeing a lot of anti-Semitism online lately, which is really unfortunate. But this is a tweet from an account called Aryan Enlightenment, which I'm guessing is like a Nazi thing. And the text says, "The Jews stole this from you." And it is a picture of a white, handsome football quarterback or whatever kissing a blonde, white cheerleader. And I was like, huh? The Jews stole something that's common all the time. I'm like, this is, and still exists. And I'm like, this is just such a loser mentality. I think what I tweeted is, the Jews didn't steal this from you. You stole this from you. Like, the only reason you weren't the quarterback of your football team is you. It's nothing to do with the Jews. Like, what? And so what I'm saying is, like, if you can't argue, if you need to censor these people because you can't explain why what they're saying is stupid and wrong, there's something wrong there, because you should be able to actually engage and expose how dumb a lot of these ideas are.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And people are often looking for any scapegoat they can find to blame for their own failures. That's a part of human nature, unfortunately. And I do think that's accurate. That's a good point. So many things that people are upset about. It's you. Look yourself in the mirror, clean up your life. As Jordan Peterson said, pick up your room, get your act together, and stop blaming other people because you're a loser. It's nobody else's fault but your own. And, I think the left has sort of coddled that mentality even further by telling people like, oh, you don't have this and that because you weren't born to money and you didn't have the right parents and you didn't have XYZ. And I want to get past that as a nation. It is your own problem. It is your own responsibility. I do still believe in like pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. Yeah, maybe people have nicer boots than you. Maybe you have to work a little harder to earn your bootstraps. I don't know, but you can still do that. You still have more privilege than virtually anybody else in the rest of the world. If you were born here in the United States, get over it and fix your life. Stop blaming other people. Well, speaking of coddled snowflakes, I want to turn our attention to Gen Z. There is a TikTok that's going pretty viral right now by a young man who's in this generation talking about the possibility of the draft being reinstituted and what that might look like given people of his age range.
Why is everybody saying Gen Z is going to get drafted? Like, no, the fuck we're not. And you know why I know that? Because we're just going to say no. Like, how are they going to actually force us to get up and go to war? I understand it was like that in like the 1940s. What else is there to do in 1940 besides shoot people? We have things to do nowadays. We have twerk, be bisexual, eat hot chip, lie. And we're also like really mentally ill. I have like 6 of these. What makes you think I'm qualified to have a gun? Like within 600 feet of anybody, including myself. And finally, like guns are like so tacky. Like, can you imagine just like pulling up with a gun? Like that is so fucking embarrassing. Like, what is this? The Revolutionary War? No. Like, let's just chat. Let's just talk.
Let's chat.
There's no need for all the like, no. No. It's not gonna happen, don't worry.
So I don't want to get like outraged or triggered over this video because it's meant in jest, and frankly, it's pretty funny. But I will just say, if we were ever at the point where like we needed Gen Z to rise up and defend America, America's done. Like we're cooked. We have no hope.
What's so wild about this is in Q&As, I actually get asked about this all the time. This is something older generations are quite worried about. Will we be able, if we actually had an existential threat, would we be able to truly rise up and fight? Would we be able to recruit? And I've said for some time, I don't think so, because even as it is right now, the military is having a very hard time recruiting. And listen, for good reasons. I'm glad that they are. Enough people have woken up to the fact that we have been waging senseless, stupid wars, that people have been dying for causes that have nothing to do with our Constitution or our national security for some time. So don't think for a minute I'm like over here feeling bad for the military. I'm not. But my point is that they're already having trouble in times of peace getting people to join peace. So I certainly think if there were like the real threat that you sign up, you're going to go to war. Yeah, I don't think that they would have a very good time trying to recruit this generation. He did mean a lot of this tongue in cheek, but he wasn't wrong. Like Americans are so over medicated right now. And I actually want to read this piece from PBS discussing some of the recruitment shortfalls briefly, because they address that is one of the reasons. They say the U.S. military has reached crisis levels of low recruitment. At the same time, the American public's perception of the armed forces is increasingly divided. In a recent Gallup poll, only 60% of respondents said they had confidence in the U.S. military, the lowest level in over 2 decades. And this is Matthew Gault, who's a writer for Vice, and he's interviewing Ollie Rogan, and he discusses military issues. And they say at the same time, some military branches are falling short of their yearly recruiting goals by the thousands. The Army is set to fall 15,000 recruits short this year alone. The Pentagon estimates that only around 23% of youths aged 17 to 24 can meet the standards for the military. The reasons why are kind of all over the place. There's a fitness standard that people can't meet. There's weird things like visible
tattoos. Yeah, that's a big one.
Yeah, I mean, that's actually a big one. Americans are quite overweight. Visible tattoos, that kind of thing could easily be waived if they needed to. Criminal, including past criminal records, no matter how minor. But also they say a big one is drug use. And by that, they don't actually just mean like marijuana. They say if you've been on a stimulant, so ADD medication, in the past 24 months, you have to get a waiver or they don't want you to join. And so he mentions that in his video that he's on a bunch of pills. You're not really supposed to have a gun when you're on many of these pills. And yeah, I think this could be a huge problem. I have to personally laugh when he said it was tacky to pull up with a gun. It was funny. No, it's not. If you're a woman, get strapped, stay strapped, protect yourself. That's bogus. Don't listen to this little guy in his dorm room. But yeah, I mean, this is going viral because I think a lot of people are thinking about this. There are concerns people have if a draft were to be brought back, who would get recruited, who wouldn't. Would women be part of the draft? I would argue, yeah, probably they would be constitutionally. If there's a draft, equal application
I think
law.
I think they should be. I
Yeah,
don't.
if they
I don't
should.
think there should ever be a draft. But if there were to be one, I think it would be wrong to only have men do
Yes.
it.
And that's why, but for me, like if they tried to draft me, I'd be a conscientious objector for the most part, unless there really was a existential threat. I'd be like Muhammad Ali, like lock me up. I'm not going. I'm not doing it.
For me, it depends on whether it was like some overseas conflict or something. But like if we were invaded by China, I think
Yeah.
I probably would. You
Right.
know,
I think there's a difference. I don't really foresee a situation. I mean, given where we're at right now, that America is at an existential place where we really have to fight for our country's,
yeah. I mean, I'm
future.
curious for your thoughts, but I personally, I do not think there will be a draft ever in our lifetimes in America again. I think the way that modern warfare is fought is so heavily on like drone strikes and air warfare and bombs and missiles, and it's like back in wars of the 20th century, there was so much more like infantry combat, and you needed bodies to throw at the enemy in a way that you don't now. Now, we do have that recruitment shortage that you mentioned, but it's not like they just need tons of untrained people to throw into battle, right? They need their slice of people to train to be highly technical and operate the weapons and go into combat zones and all that. And they need to figure out how to recruit for that, right? And
Yeah. Well,
we
and
can talk about the reasons, but a draft is not helpful for that. Just a bunch of untrained people to throw into combat is not what they will need or ever will need, in my opinion. But I could be wrong.
the PBS article actually dealt with that slightly and mentioned that that is the larger issue that they have, is that they need to be able to recruit people who are able to become highly trained in cyber technology, and that we are not producing that workforce, period, in the
And the
U.S.
draft doesn't help with that.
No, but when we do produce it, guess what? They're not going to the military. They're going to the high-paying jobs that are out there in the market. So the military is having trouble competing for those types of talent skills and intellectualism that are out there. And I think that that would be even more of a problem during times of war. So yeah, I think that I think you're right that we have a little bit less of a need for sheer numbers, but there is a shortfall. And I think that after what happened with Vietnam, I think most people would be hesitant to try to reinstitute the draft. It was something that nearly tore this country apart. It was so highly divisive. It was such a worthless war that we should never have been in the first place. And I've seen people responding to this TikTok too. And I've seen a lot of people commenting and saying, one reason you'll never see a draft again is the inability to keep rich kids out of it, because in times in the past when they had it, going to college was an exemption and that was only for rich kids. And so it was this like get out of serving free card that doesn't really exist anymore. And I thought that was actually kind of a good point.
So, my birthday is in less than a month. I'm actually about to age out of, I think, selective service. I'm pretty sure it's 18 to 25.
You can't be drafted after 25?
So they start, like, if they were to do a draft, I'm pretty sure they start with like age 20, then 21, then 22, then 23, then 24, then 25, then 18, then 19.
Wow.
I could be totally wrong. I'm talking somewhat out of my butt here, but I'm pretty sure I read that the other day. And so there might be a scenario where, but they'd have to get through like the prime age that you're in really up for selective service is 18 to 25. And after that would be like deep reserves.
Interesting. I had no idea, but that actually makes me feel better because both of my brothers are over 25. And that's one thing I've always worried about.
So speaking of young people, Hannah, this is not going to come as a shock to our viewers, but Gen Z is not okay. Like something is wrong with my peers, folks slightly younger than you. Like, they're cracked in the head. There's really no other way to put the results of this new poll from Harvard Harris. So they basically just ask people, like, do you support, if you're forced to choose, Israel or Hamas? And not Palestine. Like, they weren't asking, do you side with the Palestinian people or the Israeli government? Like a question where there's nuances, and people of good faith could come down on either side. Hamas is the terrorist group that committed the October 7 atrocities in Israel. Like, they kill civilians. And yet, some people told pollsters they favored Hamas. So overall, 84% of Americans favored Israel and just 16% favored Hamas. Among older Americans over age 65, 95% supported Israel and just 5% sympathized with Hamas. But let me read you the statistic for young people, age 18 to 24. Only 52% supported Israel, while nearly 48% said they supported Hamas. So seriously, nearly half of young respondents said they side with the terrorist group that just a couple of weeks ago targeted and slaughtered innocent civilians, women, children, and babies.
That is
chilling.
Atrocious. God. It's one of those minutes when you wish you could go into the poll results. Like, do you know what you're saying? Do you understand that Hamas
Yes, they do,
is
though.
in Palestine? Like, yes.
Because let me give you the next polling question here, and it is exactly what you just said. I wrote an article about this, and I said, you'd hope for the sake of our country that those people are supporting Hamas despite the group's violent actions, right? Like, well, I don't agree with that, but I still support them. Nope. The pollsters asked this very blunt question. Do you think the Hamas killing of 1,200 Israeli civilians in Israel can be justified by the grievances of Palestinians, or is it not justified? 51% of young people, 18 to 24, said it's justified. And here's the really crazy twist, and then I'll stop talking. They asked this same group of people, quote, do you think that the attacks on Jews were genocidal in nature or not genocidal? And 18 to 24-year-olds, 62% said they thought they were genocidal. This is the same group that said they were justified. So we have a hefty chunk of young Americans telling pollsters that yes, Hamas committed a genocide against Israelis, but also that is justified. Genocide is justified in their view. That, I don't even know how to respond to that other than to say, what the hell has gone wrong in their brains and their moral compasses? Because no matter who you side with, and there's an intense political history, right? It's not hard to not support the slaughter of civilians.
Yeah, I mean, I was gonna say you can keep speaking because I think I'm speechless. I don't even know how to process that, to be honest. It's mind-boggling. I mean, I've seen some videos over the past couple weeks of like students who appear to be Palestinian or Middle Eastern at the very least, like flicking off signs of the hostages and laughing
or
and
tearing them down.
And I think I've maybe like tried to understand that as, you know, these are people whose families have been victimized in this whole situation. They're just like overrun with hate. But like, even then it's awful to see. But if you get to Americans, like American people saying this with no history of trauma, nothing's ever happened to your family, you have no reason to have any hate or like desire for revenge or anything, like what could possess you to answer this on this kind of survey? Where in the world would you feel like any time that there was genocide that it was justified? We're in deep. I mean, we really are in trouble if this is where we're at. I can't. It doesn't make any sense. It does not make any sense. As somebody who is, like I said, long before this recent terrorist attack, like I have been very concerned about the issue of Palestine and like for the people of Palestine. And this is something I've like researched and looked into. So I'm not coming at this from not seeing the side of people who are deeply concerned with people in Palestine and what's been done to them in this region. I cannot fathom. I don't know how you can put yourself in the shoes of somebody who would be okay with the slaughter of innocent people ever, period, much less this really grotesque way that it was carried out. I mean, they killed people at a peace festival. They raped women next to the bodies of their friends. And you're okay with that. You're saying you're okay with that. You're saying
it's
sign that
justified.
It's justified. What could possibly justify that?
Yeah, I mean, an eye for an eye, you both go blind. So even if you believe that Israel has killed innocent civilians in Palestine, the solution is not to victimize more innocent people. That's broken moral logic.
Yeah, this is bleak. And I assume they're asking this at college campuses. These institutions, something's got to be done, man. I mean, really, really, I do mean to fund them all. Stop giving them taxpayer dollars. Get rid of student loans backing them. A lot of them need to go out of business. So the higher education needs a reckoning. This is not it. It's not okay.
And you know, that's the interesting question, because my editor at Newsweek, where I wrote an op-ed about that poll, asked me, like, what's your theory for why this is? And I wrote about it in the article. It's complicated. I doubt there's one reason. But if I have to say, I think it is probably in part an outgrowth of the extreme social justice ideology that is taught on college campuses that divides the entire world into black and white oppressors versus oppressed. And so the ideology that has invented like Orwellian concepts like my truth or your truth, right? Because if truth is relative, then morality is relative. And if morality is relative in the paradigm of everything being a struggle between the oppressed and the oppressors, well, they look at the Israel-Palestine conflict and they see Palestine oppressed, Israel oppressors. And people like you and I know the real world is more complicated than that. There's more shades of gray than that. The people of Palestine can simultaneously be oppressed and oppressors. Just ask gay people in Gaza, right? And the people of Israel can simultaneously be oppressors in some ways through the actions of their government and oppressed as a minority group targeted from anti-Semitism. So it's not actually this black and white worldview, but that really is how the most extreme overwrought version of social justice ideology that's inculcated on these college campuses, how it teaches people to view the world. Is like, all right, well, there's an oppressed and an oppressor, and I'm a progressive, so I support the oppressed. And so in this, you just look, your moral calculus would stop there. Well, they're oppressed, so this is just their resistance, and that's justified. Whereas a more sane worldview, a more humanistic worldview, would see the shades of gray and decry, regardless of where they rank on the hierarchy of privilege, any act of violence towards civilians. But I really do think, at least in part, it's an outgrowth of that.
It honestly just makes me think about Martin Luther King Jr. and the contrast of that civil rights movement compared to the modern progressive movement, and why this one is such a colossal failure and why his was such a success. And, you know, it really does, I guess, trace back to this age-old question of like Martin Luther King Jr. versus Malcolm X and like their theories of change, and like put me fully in the Martin Luther King Jr. camp. And I talk about his theory of change a lot when I speak around the country. But one thing I'm always struck by is that within his theory of change, he had 6 principles of nonviolence. And one of them was that you not only refuse to physically harm your opponent, you refuse to hate them. And in refusing to hate them, you prevent yourself from becoming like them, right? And I think that's what you see with these people is you are becoming the violence that you supposedly detest and hate and denounce. You're becoming the same as your opponent, you know? And I think that's true not only with the people in this poll. I think that harkens back to the politicians we were talking about earlier in this podcast. When you start becoming just like the people you say you hate, well, what's the point? What's the difference? What are you fighting for? If you're going to just try to use their same tactics and end up in a same world that they are, currently creating, then there's nothing really to choose between here. And you're not going to win people to your way of thinking. You're not going to actually have an alternative pathway. And therefore, you're going to lose in the long run. So we need so many more people of nonviolence, of peace, who have some wisdom, who have some forethought, who have some understanding of how historically oppressive systems have been successfully overturned and how there has been reunification brought to people after those occurrences have happened. And that is just sorely lacking across the board right now. All right, guys, that's a wrap. Once again, be sure to subscribe to the new YouTube channel. It is up and live. We will put a link in the show notes that are available both on YouTube and on Apple and Spotify. We would so appreciate it if you take a couple seconds to go subscribe to us there and leave us a comment. Let us know your thoughts. Also, don't forget, leave us a 5-star review on Apple. That will help other people find the show on the audio side. And take at least 1 minute to share the show with a friend this week that you think might appreciate nuance and actual concrete constitutional discussions on everything going on. And until next week, stay based.